Over the last 16 months now, the State of Israel, with full US backing, has been committing genocide in Gaza, carrying out daily massacres, displacing over 2 million Palestinians, and making the entire strip inhospitable to life. At the same time, the State of Israel has also been moving full force to annex the West Bank and continue its project of building Greater Israel. All the while, Israel has been committing aggression in my home country, Lebanon. Only a few months ago, they invaded the country, destroyed entire villages in the south, bombed huge swaths of the Be'a Valley and southern Beirut, and committed massacres the likes of which we've never seen before. At the same time, Israel, the US, and the UK have been bombing targets in Yemen, and especially civilian targets such as the seaports and the airport. And only a few weeks ago, Israel expanded its illegal occupation of Syrian territory in the Golan Heights following the collapse of the Assad regime. And amidst all of this, you have to ask yourself, where the fuck are the Arabs? The question, where are the Arabs, is not actually a new one. I think it entered public consciousness during the 80s from newsreels like this, which came out after the Sabra Shatila massacre in 1982. The Sabra and Shatila massacre, which killed over 3,000 people, mostly Palestinians, was carried out by Lebanese Christian fascist militias under the auspices of the Israelis who were occupying Beirut at the time. It revealed not only the brutality of the Israelis and their allies in Lebanon, but also the impotence and unwillingness of the Arab regimes to do anything serious to protect Palestinian lives. Many across the region were outraged by this seeming indifference. Thus, the question, where are the Arabs, and its many manifestations, became something of an anthem. But even that was a long time ago. After decades of betrayal, of political opportunism and hypocrisy, most people have become wary or have lost faith entirely in the Arab regimes as a whole. Even amidst genocide, this question is met with satire and ridicule.
صباح الخير. الصراحة امبارح متنا من السقعة، بقت الأجواء سقعة. هاي رسالة لكل الجيوش العربية، لكل الجيوش العربية، جيبوا لنا حرامات.
Despite mobilizations across the globe in the form of protests and direct actions, the genocide in Gaza has gone on unabated. A large part of this has to do with the fanatic amounts of support the State of Israel has received from its Western sponsors, in the form of diplomatic cover, non-stop military aid, or even in the beating up of anti-genocide protesters in their own streets. Another large part of the reason that we have been unable to effect any change in Gaza has to do with the nature of the Arab regimes in the Swana region. That's Southwest Asia, North Africa. We don't do any of this Middle East bullshit. I think the question, where are the Arabs, is a remnant of a long history that we have yet to reckon with, that we have yet to really learn the lessons from. It is not a history that should be seen nostalgically, but rather a history that is full of false idols and myths. But I think it is well past time that we deconstruct these myths and move past them, to really learn and reckon with the lessons from our own history as Arabs. Without that, without a joint understanding of reality and our history, I don't see how we can build a sustained movement to overthrow and combat Zionism, let alone global capitalist imperialist domination. So what I want to do is examine the question, where are the Arabs? Open it up and lay it out, so that we can at least diagnose where the roots of our problem lie. Doing so means looking at the history of the Swana region, the history of Arab nationalism, and of radical thinkers who I think are all too often ignored in the readings of this history. It also means looking honestly at the current situation and confronting the limitations of the tendencies and narratives that still very much so exist to this day. So first, if we want to answer the question, where are the Arabs? I think we first have to ask ourselves, who are the Arabs anyway? Although many trace the origins of Arab nationalism to the second half of the 19th century, it only really took off towards the end of the First World War. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled the entire Arab region for hundreds of years, was facing huge military losses at the hands of the British Army. Capitalizing on anti-Ottoman sentiments and desires for independence, the British made connections with local Arab rebels, mostly in the Hijaz region, and convinced them to ally with them. Help us defeat the Ottomans, and we will let you become independent. Of course, it didn't go that way. The Ottoman Empire fell, the wars ended, and the Western powers reneged on their promises. Instead, through the secretly negotiated Sykes-Picot Agreement, the British and French carved up the entire region. This is all basically the premise of the film, Lawrence of Arabia.
British and Arab interests are one and the same.
Possibly.
Ha! Ha! Upon my word, sir, you're ungrateful.
In case you're wondering, yes, that was Obi-Wan Kenobi in full brown face. For about 2 decades after the First World War, the entire region was controlled almost completely by the British and the French. That said, the struggle for independence never went away, with numerous revolts being waged and heavily suppressed. The states that were formed in that period were very heavily linked to empire. For instance, the head of the Jordanian army at the time was a British officer by the name of John Bagot Glubb, shamelessly named Glubb Pasha. Fast forward to the Second World War, more states were given independence, but that same colonial link still existed. But the most significant event in the region at the time was the Nakba of 1948, when Zionist militias expelled over 800,000 Palestinians from historic Palestine. The war that followed, referred to as the First Arab-Israeli War, was at best a half-assed effort by the Arab armies and regimes. The myth of the 5 Arab armies, or that the Zionist militias were fighting against extermination, is just that, a myth. Uncoordinated and uncommitted, these armies never posed a real threat. The only Arab army that was equipped and able to do anything substantial, the Jordanians, did not actually put up a fight. They went into Palestine and stopped basically at what we now know as the West Bank. They ruled the territory for 20 years, up until 1967, we'll get to that in a bit. But also, the Jordanian monarchy has been in cahoots with the Zionists since at least the 30s, and so there was never really any serious threat from that side. The failure of the Arab leaders and their armies to prevent the Nakba from happening, or from doing anything meaningful thereafter, enraged populations across the region. This was also the beginning of a period full of political debate and experimentation. The 40s, 50s, and 60s saw a huge upswell in political thinking, organizing, analysis, what some call a political renaissance. Arab nationalism, Arab socialism, third worldism, liberation movements, Islamic nationalism, the list is endless. And so too is the incredibly long list of political organizations and parties and tendencies that formed at the time. And so it was that in 1952, a group of middle-ranking military men, known as the Free Officers, seized power in Egypt and overthrew the highly unpopular King Farouk. Following the successful and highly popular coup in Egypt, many others followed suit. In Syria, Iraq, Sudan, Libya, all of these officers and the movements behind them were heavily influenced by the most potent political tendency of the time, Arab nationalism. Seeing the borders that Western powers created in the region as a form of divide and rule, these intellectual and political movements envisioned reunification as a form of anti-imperialism. That is, we Arabs were once one contiguous nation. The West control us by dividing us, and so we must reunify to restore real independence. There were so many fierce debates about what that actually means. Regional federations, economic cooperation, military alliances, but most importantly, the distinction between local nationalisms and pan-Arabism. That is, Egyptian nationalism and Syrian nationalism around being Arab versus the creation of one entire Arab nation. By and large, the main two camps of Arab nationalism were Nasserism, that is, gravitating towards the policies and thinking of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the highly charismatic president of Egypt, and the Ba'ath Party, whose motto was unity, freedom, socialism. The former being very popular in Egypt and North Africa, the latter in Syria, Iraq, and to a lesser extent, Lebanon and Jordan. The Arab nationalist project and the regimes that came from it were supported by the Soviet Union, which at the time was the chief international rival of Western imperialist powers. And the main expression of Western imperialism in the Arab region was, and still is, the settler colonial state of Israel. So naturally, a lot of expressions of anti-imperialism were dead set against this state, which also constituted a rupture in the heart of the region. Zionism presented itself not only as an obstacle to the fulfillment of the Arab nationalist project, but also as a common unifying enemy that all these regimes and movements could rally around, one which needed to be confronted militarily. And so, in 1957, when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, kicking out the French and British companies, Israel, like a good colonial outpost, invaded Egypt. Soon after, the British and the French followed suit, and thus began what is now known as the Suez Crisis. It would prove to be a failure for the European powers and a victory for Nasser, which provided a boon for the Arab nationalist projects and regimes. The next major military confrontation came in 1967, and the results were completely the opposite. The lead up to the war is kind of complicated, so it's enough to say that tensions were high. With Palestinian fighters launching attacks from Syria, the Israelis amassed their armies on the Golan Heights, and Egypt amassed their armies in the Sinai. Although many describe it as brinkmanship, the Israeli narrative, which is still really hegemonic, is that an invasion was imminent, and so they conducted what is notoriously known as a preemptive strike. In fact, it was premeditated aggression, one that had been planned months in advance. Operation Focus was the name given to the aerial assault that saw the Israeli Air Force, within hours, destroy the joint air forces of the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and the Syrians, with the planes still sitting in the tarmac, completely undefended, unprotected, and uncovered. The war would go on for only another 6 days, with no Arab victories whatsoever. Meanwhile, the Israelis expanded the territories that they controlled, occupying the rest of historic Palestine, that is, Gaza and the West Bank. They occupied the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. This military defeat, referred to only as the Naksa, the setback, proved to be the death knell of the Arab nationalist project. Disenfranchisement with the project grew, both popularly and politically. The second death knell came just 3 years after, with the sudden death of Abdel Nasser at the age of only 52. Thereafter, leaders who would openly champion their pan-Arabist credentials turned inwards and focused on consolidating power on their own populations within their own states. The rest of the political history of the Swana region is kind of a shit show. But yes, the period leading up to the 70s, the period of Abdel Nasser, is often referred to and remembered as the golden era of Arab nationalism and therefore of our region. It's often remembered with nostalgia and seen as an era which we should try to emulate or restore. One of the most notable and popular expressions of this nostalgia has to be the 1996 song The Arab Dream, which is kind of like the pan-Arab version of We Are the World. The song The Arab Dream is sung by 21 different Arab singers, each representing a different Arab country. The lyrics of the song are floral and poetic, more like a love song than a political one. The song was released with this music video, which shows the singers performing the song, but also a series of archival clips that track key events in the history of the Palestinian struggle and the history of Arab nationalism. Put together, this film links the two, outlines how the Palestinian cause is inseparable from Arab identity, and suggests that the former can only be resolved through Arab unity. Essentially, it seems to suggest that what we really need now is a new Abdel Nasser. My problem with these forms of nostalgia is, well, aside from their vague, apolitical posing as political lyrics, is that they lack any serious acknowledgement of the limitations and failures of the Arab nationalist project. In my opinion, these forms of nostalgia kind of borrow the logic of the Naksa. That is, we do not have anything to learn, we simply have to dust ourselves off and try again. Such uncritical veneration for this past, mixed in with the lack of a joint political vision, is a recipe for disaster. And I think that's exactly what we saw when the song was performed live in Beirut in 1998. The concert was held in Martyr Square, downtown Beirut. Organizers estimated 700,000 people attended. Some of the singers, namely the Syrian, Iraqi, and Kuwaiti performers, were prevented from performing because of various political reasons. Notice as well the heavy armed presence. And in peak poetic irony, in a performance celebrating Arab unity, a fight broke out.
التضامن والوحدة والتعاون أحلام عربية حاولت أوبريت الحلم العربي تجسيدها، إنما يبدو أنه في وطننا العربي هذا تتدخل المصالح السياسية حتى في الأحلام. ما يبيدون الجزيرة من ساحة الشهداء في وسط بيروت.
What I will say before going further in dissecting Arab nationalism as a project and idea is, firstly, that it is undeniable that there are cultural, linguistic, and historical links that tie together communities across the Swana region. Secondly, the Arab nationalist project did intimidate the US and the State of Israel, which is why the US greatly increased its support militarily for Israel following its successes in 1967. But that doesn't mean that these ideologies don't have deep structural flaws. It doesn't mean that it's the best we can do for ourselves and for those oppressed around us. One of the main critiques of Arab nationalism, which is applicable to all nationalisms, is the essentialism of the Arab, as though we are one contiguous blob of people. After all, we are speaking about 500 million people, stretching vast geographies from Amman to Morocco. But this critique is also applicable to much smaller nations. Nations are not organic facts, as much as nationalist thinkers and politicians would like us to believe. But they are much more, as Benedict Anderson describes them, imagined political communities. Not imaginary, but imagined. And that is an important distinction to make, because it is an active process that is designed and developed by certain groups and individuals with something to gain, whether politically or economically. Creating those communities comes with a tremendous amount of violence, not only against those other nations, but also inwards, to those political subjects who do not fit the mold. What is an ideal Arab? What is not? And most importantly, who gets to decide? These are questions that are left ambiguous within nationalist thinking, but yet it is exactly those questions that leads to the most atrocious events in our history. Two major examples of this exact thing are the case of the persecution of Kurds and Arab Jews, both of whom found themselves excluded by Arab nationalism for one reason or another. Edward Said, the Palestinian public intellectual, wrote a very concise description of this in 1980 in his book The Question of Palestine. Thus, to the walls constructed by Zionism have been added walls constructed by a dogmatic, almost theological brand of Arabism. As we know with all walls, their purpose is much more for controlling those within them than anything to do with those outside of them. And so essentially, in confronting a racist exclusionary ideology, Arab nationalists created their own racist exclusionary ideology to rally and ultimately subdue their own populations. Despite talking endlessly about unity, their policies created nothing but conformity and division, never really unifying anything, let alone the entire Arab Ummah. In fact, the Arab nationalist regimes were afraid of actual unity, fearing that it would detract from their own power. They thus captured the entire political space and prevented any other form of organizing or political power to emerge under their rule. To that end, Said goes on to say, this led quite naturally to the consolidation of police states, the absence of freedom of expression, and a whole set of human rights abuses, all supposedly justified in the name of fighting Zionist aggression, which meant that any form of oppression at home was acceptable because it served the sacred cause of national security. Another critique of Arab nationalism, which is based on their own criteria for themselves, is that it's not very good at combating Zionism or imperialism. It's just not, and I think the history shows that very clearly. Those regimes lost in 67, and again in 73, which was mostly just an attempt at recapturing territory they'd lost 6 years earlier. They were never even coordinated amongst themselves, often being highly mistrustful of each other's motives. The model of standing armies, of highly bureaucratized security states, of strongmen leaders, has yielded none of the victories that they've talked endlessly about. Lastly, although they're posed as polar opposites, there is a very important similarity between Arab nationalism and Islamism. Both have a sort of messianic approach, believing that one day the Ummah will rise and wake up and rise to the occasion, and in that restore a glorious past. In my final use of Edward Said in this video essay, here he is describing his opposition to this type of thinking.
That we can't, in the end of the 20th century, return to some earlier ideal, A, because the ideal is irrecoverable, and B, because all such returns involve a new politics of domination, and essentially authoritarianism, dogmatism, whereas I felt the role of the intellectual and the role of the Palestinian movement was effectively to present a new critical understanding of the contemporary world.
The Arab nationalist platitudes still exist today, but they ring more hollow than ever. In this moment of accelerated genocide, none of the Arab regimes have done anything to stop it. That's not to say they haven't done anything, because some of them are supporting the Israelis in their efforts. Up until a few months ago, when the Israelis captured the crossings in Rafah, the Egyptians were literally participants in the siege of Gaza. Jordan, for its part, has been allowing its land route to be used by the Israelis to get in aid to essentially ease the blockade that it's experiencing in the Red Sea by Ansar Allah, also known as the Houthis. Practically every single regime in the Swana region is a puppet regime, held up by euros and by dollars and by brute force. The only exception to this are non-state actors, and I guess Syria, but that's got a whole other thing going for it, and we'll get to that in a bit. Some see all of this, the lack of solidarity with Palestinians, the push for normalization with the State of Israel, as a break from the past. Some see it as a problem just with the leaders that we have now. Sure, it is more blatant, but I do think there is a thread that connects those Arab nationalist regimes to the present moment of Arab normalization. I think if there is a framework to really understand the question, where are the Arabs, then we have to talk about class. In 1971, the Palestinian revolutionary intellectual and militant organizer Ghassan Kanafani sat for an interview with an Australian broadcaster. This is one of the very few remaining films of Ghassan Kanafani that we still have today. If you've seen this interview, you've probably seen this clip.
You don't mean exactly peace talks, you mean capitulation, surrendering.
Why not just talk?
Talk to whom?
Talk to the Israeli leaders.
That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean?
There is, however, another part of the interview which I very rarely seen shared.
We consider the Arab governments two kinds. Something we call reactionaries, who are completely connected with imperialists, like King Hussein government, like Saudi Arabian government, like Moroccan government, Tunisian government. And then we had some other Arab governments which we call the military petit bourgeoisie governments. That's like Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Algeria, so on.
So, just a bit of modern translation. The petit bourgeoisie is most analogous to the middle class, neither workers renting out their labor, nor the wealthy elite who own the means of production. Think small landowners or small business owners who work alongside one or two employees. Think Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob, or Bob from Bob's Burgers. I mean, even Moe from The Simpsons owned his own tavern. These are not necessarily wealthy individuals, but they do own some means of production, some ways of gaining capital. This is what chiefly distinguishes them from the workers or the peasants. I do prefer the term petit bourgeoisie, because embedded within it is the ambitions of this certain class, which tends to not be in solidarity with the working class, or God forbid the poor, but rather with ambitions to become part of the higher bourgeoisie, whose political and social affiliations can be summed up as such.
هم يهمهم مصر ولا انجليزي الواحد مستعد يكون عفريت ازرق من غير المله ولا وطن بس المهم احافظ على فلوسي وجلد.
But back to Kanafani, his description of the two types of governments, I think, strikes at the heart of Arab nationalism and the prevailing wisdoms around it, particularly the nostalgia. What he's saying is that neither are comrades to Palestinian liberation movements, and that revolutionary activists and organizers and militants should organize against both. In many ways, his analysis still holds up. And in others, well, things have changed quite a bit. Still, a class-based analysis is a really important tool to understand these regimes beyond nationalist, religious, or mythic boundaries. So let's dissect. For the first group he mentions, the Saudi, Jordanian, and Moroccan governments, rather monarchies, have always been loyal imperialist regimes that have never done anything in way of actually combating imperialism or Zionism. These regimes have either already or are now in the process of normalizing with the State of Israel. They are also deeply reactionary capitalist states, with dynastic monarchies and a wealthy bourgeoisie patronage. These regimes have much more to profit from the project of Zionism than they do from the project of Palestinian liberation. Aside from a few grumblings here or there, there's no serious opposition or anti-imperialism from any of these regimes. The only sort of exception to this was the 1973 oil embargo by OPEC, that is, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Basically, a bunch of these Gulf monarchies decided to cut oil exports, cut production, in protest of Western support for the Israelis during the 1973 war.
What happens if the US resorts to force and occupies the oil fields in Saudi Arabia?
There are some sensitive areas in the oil fields in Saudi Arabia which will be immediately blown up.
By yourself? By your people?
Of course. And then what will happen is Europe has to live, and Japan, of course, has to live without oil from Saudi Arabia for so many years.
But as I said, this was an exception, and had much more to do with regional posturing than anything to do with anti-imperialism or solidarity with Palestinians. On the whole, all of these regimes, specifically the oil monarchies, are deeply embedded within Western imperialism, who in fact are the main buyers of their oil. All of these regimes are also little imperialist powers themselves. Morocco, for instance, continues to occupy the Western Sahara, which it has done since 1979. The UAE, the more recent addition to this lovely list, has been backing the Janjaweed in Sudan, which has been committing genocide, specifically in the Darfur, as well as looting the nation's natural resources and bringing them back to the patron state. And Saudi, Saudi has been engaged in aggression in Yemen for the last 9 years. It crushed the Bahraini Revolution in 2013, and just generally meddles in regional politics. For instance, that one time that they kidnapped our prime minister in 2016 and forced him to resign live on air.
إنه أنا راجع إن شاء الله قريبا ما تشيلوا هم لبنان يعني حنضلنا مكملين هالمشوار وإن شاء الله بنكمل مع بعض جميعا.
أيضا خلينا نقول دكتور الرئيس إنه كل الأطراف اللبنانية يمكن بدها تسمع كلمة منك اليوم ليعرفوا.
Now, for the other category that Kanafani lays out, it's a bit more interesting, because therein lies a lot of the contention that still exists to this day. These are precisely the regimes that are subject to what I call Arab dream nostalgia, but I think using a class-based analysis, we see them not so much as a dream, but more of a nightmare, or at least one of those impotency dreams where your teeth are falling out. So, military petit bourgeoisie governments. Let's unpack that. Kanafani lists Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Algeria. I'll focus on the first two, because it's the ones I know most about, but also it's where Arab nationalism really was developed and experimented the most. The interview with Kanafani was filmed on October 1970. Only a month earlier, Abdel Nasser passed away, capping 18 years of rule. Only a month after, Hafez al-Assad took power in Syria, as well as taking over the Ba'ath Party, which had already been ruling the country for 7 years. Both regimes came about through military coups, and both subsequently militarized their respective societies and created carceral surveillance states. Egypt, to this day, still holds tens of thousands of political prisoners in its state dungeons. While working on this video essay, the Assad regime in Syria fell, and we got to see for the very first time the insides of these labyrinthian dungeons where tens of thousands were disappeared, held, and tortured. Seeing the insides of these prisons, most notably the notorious Saidnaya prison, revealed that the worst descriptions had been true. And even though it's not really comparable to the modern manifestations of the Egyptian and Syrian state, even back in Abdel Nasser's day, political prisoners were regularly held, including communists, socialists, agitators, artists, such as the legendary Egyptian singer and songwriter Sheikh Imam, whose music I've littered this video essay with. But back to the original point, the military nature of these regimes has drastically altered the landscape of the political scene in the region as a whole. I mean, even the fact that King Abdullah of Jordan feels the need to publish videos like this once a month reveals the deep fascination and veneration of the army and of strong military men. The military invariably treats the country like an army, providing belonging, providing identity, but no participation, only obedience and hierarchy. Now, the petit bourgeoisie part. That's also very interesting, because not only will it allow us to see these regimes differently, but it contradicts exactly what they said about themselves, what they still say about themselves through this nostalgic lens. Alongside Arab nationalism, most of these regimes espoused Arab socialist economic policies. Many enacted land reforms and other policies of wealth distribution, much to the ire of the imperialist-backed higher bourgeoisie, the economic elite. Some moved towards nationalization of key industries and assets, most notably Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. These economic policies chiefly benefited the petit bourgeoisie, and although this class, being nationals within a post-colonial setting, do operate differently than those within the capitalist imperialist centers, revolutionaries like Kanafani were a bit sus about them. In 1968, Kanafani, as a core member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP, wrote an honestly fascinating manifesto. Although the group would radically change in the coming decades, and largely abandon any of its radical potential that it had to begin with, at the time it advocated for working-class revolution and for armed struggle. They saw these two things as essential components for any liberatory struggle, whether that be Arab liberation, Palestinian liberation, or any liberation movement within the Global South aiming to end imperialist capitalist domination. In the manifesto, they acknowledge that the petit bourgeoisie is quite a large and substantial class within Arab society, and that it can be an ally to the revolution, but they warn that it should never be placed at the helm. Of the regimes where this did happen, they wrote this: "These regimes struck at the interests of feudalism and capitalism and their exploitation of the masses, but they preserved the petit bourgeoisie and its interests in the industrial, agricultural, and commercial sectors, at the same time producing a new class of military men, politicians, and administrative personnel whose interests became interlocked with those of the petit bourgeoisie, thus forming within it the upper class in these communities." They go on to say, far more concisely, "This class is antagonistic to colonialism and reaction, but at the same time wants to keep the privileges which it enjoys." Beyond their rhetoric, these Arab nationalist regimes were functionally state capitalist economic entities. None of them made any attempts to abolish or even collectivize private property. Even those industries that were nationalized simply moved from colonial hands into native hands. Here, Frantz Fanon can be quite helpful, albeit a bit verbose. The national bourgeoisie steps into the shoes of the former European settlement. Doctors, barristers, traders, commercial travelers, general agents, and transport agents. From now on, it'll insist that all the big foreign companies should pass through its hands, whether these companies wish to keep on their connections with the country or to open it up. The national middle class discovers its historic mission, that of intermediary. The working class in Egypt and Syria, as well as the entire region, continued to be exploited under wage labor. Over the decades, things only got worse. Sadat in Egypt began liberalizing the economy in the 70s. Assad, for his part in Syria, began rolling back any subsidies in the 80s. And in the last 3 decades, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, all of the regimes across the Arab world have turned to neoliberal economic policies, which have enriched a small group of neo-colonial elites while exploiting and dispossessing the masses of people. With neoliberalism comes the selling off of public assets. Egypt today is functionally a failed state, which is propped up by foreign aid and an intensely brutal carceral system which prevents any opposition or contestations of power. Syria as well, up until the fall of Assad, was a neoliberal state that enriched a tiny percentage and dispossessed the rest, and upheld itself purely through violence, through force, and an unbelievably brutal carceral system. And again, contrary to the regime's rhetoric, both have historically maligned Palestinian resistance and actively suppressed Palestinian activity that stemmed from its territories. The sole focus of these regimes has always been inwards, in consolidating power within their own states, their own nationalism, usually around the leader himself. All these regimes had absolutely nothing to do with anti-imperialism, with socialism, with Arab unity, or with Palestinian liberation. In fact, if there was a thing called the Arab nation, then it was divided twofold, first by the imperialists, and then by these nationalist regimes that solidified and consolidated these state borders. In this sense, these regimes reified the colonial borders that they initially claimed to be working to dismantle. This ties together the 2 categories that Kanafani had named, because not only do they both have an interest in consolidating power in their respective states, but also in reifying the very idea of their states as distinct from the rest of the Arab world. As for the Palestinians, this period is one of complete abandon. It was a time that saw the emergence, or I guess re-emergence, of the Palestinian bourgeoisie, which gravitated towards its own little domination and collaboration with the Zionist occupation. The Palestinian Authority is a notorious expression of this national split. The PA not only controls certain areas of the West Bank, but it is functionally a security apparatus for the occupation. As I speak these words, the Palestinian Authority is engaged in open warfare against Palestinian militants in Jenin.
The Palestinian Authority's vehicles are similar to the ones that were used by the Israeli military years ago, but the Israeli military has upgraded. And so the PA actually now uses these vehicles to carry out operations in the West Bank in a similar fashion to the Israeli military.
The attitudes and tactics of the Palestinian Authority, which reflects the desires of the Palestinian bourgeoisie, which in turn reflects the attitudes and tactics of the Arab bourgeoisie writ large, has never been able to meaningfully support Palestinian struggles for liberation. Quite the opposite. The Palestinian struggle is a struggle of the dispossessed. Standing by the Palestinians, in a very real sense, means placing yourself in the crosshairs of not only the Israelis, but also of the Western imperialists as well. This is something that the bourgeoisie in the Arab world, indeed the bourgeoisie anywhere in the world, would never do. To antagonize the world's foremost capitalist powers is not good for business, and so too is standing in solidarity with the communities that they oppress. It's much easier and much more profitable to just go along with it. Say a nice few words, oppress your own people if you have to, but all in all, stay in power. Because, power has a logic of its own. And since Kanafani spoke those words, things have only gotten worse. The distinction between the two groups has only thinned, especially since Egypt signed its peace agreements with the State of Israel, and states like the UAE and Saudi have become military powers in their own right. All of the Arab regimes across the board have failed Palestinians, have failed their own populations, and have provided no alternative, no other option for people to turn to. Well, there always is one option.
هبوا ضحايا الاضطهاد ضحايا جوع الاضطرار بركان فكر في افتقاد هذا آخر انفجار.
In August of 1975, the Lebanese National Movement, a coalition of progressive and leftist forces, put forth a proposal to end the fighting that had seized the country only 4 months earlier. The armed conflict in Lebanon began as an attempt to either change or defend the sectarian system, depending on your viewpoint. The LNM's proposal was not simply to readjust the sectarian balance, but to abolish the sectarian system altogether. The fighting between the two camps would rage on for another year, and ultimately manifest into the 15-year-long war that would be known as the Lebanese Civil War. The lead-up to that 1975 moment, I think, has haunting similarities to the lead-up to 2019, specifically to the October 17 uprisings in Lebanon. Examining those parallels a bit more in depth, I think reveals a lot about the state of the region today, especially in relation to revolution and counter-revolution. Like other Arab states, the idea of Lebanon as a state really came about following the First World War. It was one of the colonial projects born from the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and was created in such a way to satisfy French interests in the region. This colonial legacy is baked into the very structure of the Lebanese state. This might sound a bit strange to some, but the way the Lebanese state was conceived initially mirrors very closely the early conceptions of the Zionist state. This is why many leftists in Lebanon refer to the state as the Lebanese entity. Patrick Seal, the British historian, described this thing very well when he was describing the creation of Greater Lebanon in 1920. Greater Lebanon was intended as a haven for the predominant Maronite community, France's main clients. But in terms of geopolitics, it was also conceived as a French fortress in the eastern Mediterranean, which could be used against European rivals as well as against Arab nationalists of the Syrian interior. Move a few words around, and that's basically exactly how Herzl described the future Jewish state. The Lebanese sectarian elite would declare independence in 1943, but would maintain very friendly relations with the former colonial overlords, the French. On the surface of it, this sectarian system that they adopted seems like a compromise with the realities of the very diverse religious backgrounds of the many communities in Lebanon. The main problem being that only one sect were given disproportionate amounts of power, i.e. the Maronite Christian sect, who were not only given the presidency, the head of the army, but also the largest share of seats in the parliament. But in reality, the sectarian system has always been a system of class domination from all the elites of all the sects, with the Maronite sect at the helm. Mehdi Amil, the late Lebanese Marxist intellectual, wrote some of the most clarifying and unique analysis of the sectarian system. To Amil, the sect, as a political entity, was a tool for the local bourgeoisie, be it Maronite, Muslim, Druze, to take over from the French and basically continue their system of class domination. It's not merely a fact that Lebanon has many sects and so a system was created to reflect that reality. The opposite. The sectarian bourgeoisie in Lebanon, that is, notable families from the urban coastal areas of the country, who gained a lot from the French Mandate era, saw within the sectarian system an ability to control and exploit the rest of the country, specifically the masses of the rest of the country. Through this system, they were able to increase their power politically and economically, which they did by converting the country into a financial hub, kind of the Dubai of its time.
Beirut is the most westernized of all Arab capitals. The evidence of the French colonial period here is as stark as it is in Quebec. In the days of the French, Beirut was a Mediterranean tourist paradise. Still, there are traces of this slowly disappearing past splendor. But as surely as the Middle East turmoil keeps away the tourists, it keeps away the business too, especially the banking business that had made Beirut the financial capital of the Middle East.
The sectarian system in Lebanon held many contradictions, which all came to the surface by the late 1960s. The economy at the time could be described as proto-neoliberal, as in, we were doing neoliberalism before it became cool. In what is ostensibly referred to as the golden age of Lebanon, the 1960s, which is represented by images like this, wealth inequality was skyrocketing. People were suffering, and the only people who were benefiting were the wealthy elite. So in the years leading up to 1975, Lebanon saw wave after wave of labor strikes, of actions, of protests, really of a strong emboldened labor movement. Mehdi Amel describes this process when he's describing the obstacles in maintaining this sectarian system. The foremost obstacle was the mass of toilers who belong to the downtrodden sects and live either in the countryside or in the clutches of poverty in the capital. As their voices were raised, so did their acts of resistance. They demanded the system be changed, whether by putting an end to sectarian hegemony without destroying the system itself, or by putting an end to the system entirely. It was in this context that the Lebanese national movement, in alliance with Palestinian groups who were based in Beirut at the time, came up with their reform package to change the sectarian system. They did so first through political means, but when that failed, they decided to take up arms. The reforms in question had the backing of a very broad range of groups, from Marxists to liberals to nationalists to socialists, and on and on. But despite that, the reforms were actually kind of mild. It was not a call for revolution, but for the reforming of a system that's so clearly broken. In his book, A History of Modern Lebanon, Lebanese Marxist historian Fouad Trabulsi outlines what this package actually meant for the state and for the movements who were backing it. The principal tactics of the LNM were to impose a new superstructure on the Lebanese oligarchy, bourgeois, modern, and non-sectarian, instead of its feudal, sectarian, and underdeveloped superstructure. As rational and moderate as these reforms may have been, they were still met by intense violence by the hegemonic political party, the Phalange, in order to protect the status quo and their domination under this system. Amin Jmeil, who is the son of the founder of the Phalange and would-be Israeli president of the State of Lebanon, said this in 1975. "We have tried to save institutions from any change. Although violence leads nowhere, it has helped us at least to save what could be saved. It was violence to conserve the system." It was clear to everybody that the attempt to change the sectarian system in Lebanon would antagonize the political parties and leaders who stood most to benefit from that system. But also, changing and challenging that system would antagonize other powers across the region. This is also something that the leaders of the Lebanese national movement knew. For instance, here is Kamal Jumblatt, one of the main, most important figures of the Lebanese national movement.
ما ننسى إنه إلغاء الطائفية السياسية على المنهج الدولي سيفجر جميع الأنظمة العربية التقدمية منها والرجعية. فالحركة الوطنية من الناحية صارت خطر على معظم الأنظمة العربية.
Jumblatt's analysis would prove to be fatally accurate. In 1976, the Assad regime invaded Lebanon, came to the defense of the far-right Phalange, and attacked the Palestinians and the Lebanese national movement. It enabled numerous massacres, most notoriously that of Tel al-Za'atar, in which thousands of Palestinian refugees were slaughtered at the hands of the far-right Christian militias who had been besieging the refugee camp for months prior. The Syrian invasion all but destroyed the Lebanese national movement. In March of the following year, the Syrians would assassinate the head of the Lebanese national movement, Kamal Jumblatt. With the national movement fractured, the conflict spiraled and turned into a completely intractable mess. And so, when in 78 and 82, the Israelis invaded Lebanon, again to also support the Phalange and to attack the Palestinians, the Syrians did not put up much of a fight. The Lebanese civil war formally came to an end in 1990 with the signing of the Ta'if Accord. This agreement resolved none of the core political issues that started the fighting to begin with. All it did was shift the sectarian balance a little bit. And in many ways, the civil war never really ended. The warlords who started the war, the warlords who came to power during the war, are still very much so in power. The sectarian system, which was the cause of the initial fight, still remains. The State of Israel still exists and poses an ever-increasing threat on all of us. But what's most haunting about reading this history is the similarities to the present moment, specifically to the lead-up of the 2019 revolution. I first began looking deeper into the roots of the civil war in 2019, and it's important to note this is a history that is forbidden from being taught in classrooms in Lebanon. And so what I began to realize is that a lot of the core demands of the Lebanese national movement were very similar to some of the core demands of the protest movements of the revolution in 2019. And when you think about it, it is the same exact political system, the same economic model, and in some ways, the same leaders as well. The first attempt to reform the system, in 1975, was sabotaged by the Assad regime, and now, if anything, it's more entrenched than ever. Like all revolutionary movements across the region, we were not simply rebelling against this or that government, but rather against the system that has been in place and had been exploiting and oppressing us for decades. When we take into account colonialism, centuries. These Arab regimes, who are subject to continuous revolt across the region, are far more willing to kill protesters than to reform. Indeed, far more willing to kill Arabs than to do anything to resist Zionism or Israelis.
إسرائيل هجمت على جنوب لبنان. والعرب وينهم؟ كمان هجموا على إسرائيل؟ لا على بعضهم.
Arab populations know this, and that's why whenever you hear anything about Arab regimes at a protest, it's always in the form of satire or ridicule. I made a point of emphasizing the sins of the Assad regime for a few reasons. Mostly, of all the Arab regimes, it is the one whose nature and intentions is still to this day obfuscated. It was also the last remaining remnant of that Arab nationalist project and kept up that rhetoric until the very end. Some on the left saw this regime as a bastion of anti-imperialism, of socialism, and of solidarity with the Palestinians. But its 54-year-long reign shows the complete opposite. Most notably, over the last 13 years, Assad destroyed the country in a counter-revolutionary war under the slogan, Assad or we burn the country. He had sold the country to foreign interests, most notably Russia and Iran. After his fall, the Israelis moved quickly to bomb weapons depots, airfields, and even the navy, in a clear sign that they are more scared of whatever's to come than they ever were of the Assad regime. Lest we forget that in the 23 years that Bashar al-Assad ruled Syria, he did not fire one single shot at the Israelis. Indeed, the Golan Heights was the calmest border that the Israelis have. The Israelis also bombed the immigration and passport buildings in Damascus, which, if nothing else, is very curious. What is it exactly in those files they didn't want people to see? But regardless, when Syrians in 2011 were protesting, and they were chanting, "Where are the Arabs?" while being gunned down, it gave the question new meaning. In many ways, the revolutions we've seen over the last decade and a half are attempts at breaking the political and temporal grip these regimes have over us. That is, their attempt to keep us in the 20th century, to keep us from progressing further, from progressing beyond them. Intellectuals that are allegiant to these regimes, whether they know it or not, also contribute to this stifling process. Still to this day, there are songs, tendencies, strategies, narratives that stem from the Arab nationalist project, that stem from the 20th century, that are not just useless and boring, but incredibly harmful as well. It's not that people actually want Abdel Nasser to come back from the dead, but rather that they see an Abdel Nasser in certain leaders around us. I think some see that in Khamenei, some see that in Erdogan, basically a strong leader who will unify the Ummah to rise up together. But the exact same discrepancy between what the mouth says and what the hand does is at play, between what they say and what they do. They speak of solidarity, but they are only interested in their own power. They speak of unification, but create only schisms. They speak of anti-imperialism, meanwhile doing their own little imperialism. They speak about liberating Palestine, while oppressing populations under their rule. Some people still have faith in the idea that a strong man will rise from our ranks, will lead us to victory, and will liberate us. It's not going to happen, and this emphasis on victory is honestly like a historic gaslight. I cannot speak about it without getting incredibly emotional. We look around and all we see is humiliation, is suffering, is this deep despair and defeat. And we're not allowed to talk about it, because you talk about this publicly and you're labeled a defeatist. And it is just so stifling and frustrating, because we cannot create new alternatives if we continue to lie to ourselves, believe the lies that those who are in power tell us. This isn't just about morale. This is about the truth. And I don't see how we can build real alternatives to these regimes, to the hegemony of Western imperialism in our region, without at least having a common understanding of the reality around us. A part of that is recognizing how interconnected Arab liberation from these regimes is to Palestinian liberation from Zionism. Thus, in 1971, George Habash of the PFLP declared, "The road to Jerusalem passes through Amman." I do want to note, Habash himself was a very problematic figure, And if that quote sounded familiar, it's because most recently it was used to justify counter-revolutionary interventions in Syria, specifically by Hezbollah.
نعم طريق القدس يمر بالقلمون وبالزبداني وبحمص وبحلب وبدرعا وبالسويدة وبالحسكة.
But still, I think the original logic still holds true, which is a call for internationalist revolution as the most meaningful way to support Palestinian struggles for liberation. As leftists, we need to move past the old and tired strategies and tactics of the past. And here, I'm not just talking about Arabs. I think a lot of Western leftists are too still stuck in the 20th century. Some are sentimental of the Soviet Union and see in Putin a kind of cold warrior, which is kind of absurd. Many people are still holding on to this idea that a capital R revolution is just around the bend. But are we even prepared for it? Is it wise to be pinning so many of our hopes, indeed in many cases our very survival, on a political earthquake that may never come? I think there's so much to unpack there, with our kind of collective inability to move beyond the 20th century, to be real and to do a serious introspection about the tactics and strategies that failed, not only because our enemies were stronger or superior or whatever, but also because of internal contradictions and limitations which we've never fully addressed. In a very structural way, the entire Levant is bound by the legacies of the First World War. And as naive as it may sound, I can see no other way to meaningfully change the equation we find ourselves in without radical transformation of the political makeup of the region, and with it, the borders. What replaces them, God knows. But what's clear is that these regimes will not allow any break from their hegemony, from their rule. And in a time when change is more necessary than ever for our very survival, when the genocidal Zionist entity is let completely loose, when Arab regimes are practicing the most despotic and murderous practices, when climate change is threatening the entire civilization as we know it, we need revolutionary thinking. But what does that even mean? As I said earlier, when it comes to the issue of revolution, a lot of people are still imagining the capital R revolution, this tsunami of political change that will wipe the slate clean. I think that's why a lot of people who initially had a lot of time for Palestine were quickly burnt out. I think they expected things to happen quickly, that they would go down to the streets, protest, set shit on fire, and the government would respond and give in to their demands. But of course, it doesn't go that way. While I'm not opposed to those tactics, I do think there needs to be more serious thinking around strategy and around narratives. On that topic, the Palestinian journalist Mariam Barghouti had this to say on an Instagram reel released last year.
Did you guys ever wonder why you're trying so hard but making no moves? About a decade ago, someone asked me, what can we do for Palestine? I said, work with your community. Make sure your community is well taken care of. Make sure your community is educated. Make sure your community is healthy and well. Do you know why I said that? Because you can't fight when you're unwell.
This is true for Palestinians. It's true for many other movements in the global south. Mariam's words echo those of Ala Abdel Fattah, who still to this day languishes in Egyptian dungeons under Sisi's rule. In a letter he wrote in 2013, while in the notorious Toa prison, he wrote, "Fix your own democracy. This has always been my answer to the question, how can we help? I still believe it's the only possible answer. Not only is where you live, work, vote, pay tax, and organize the place where you have more influence, but a setback for human rights in a place where democracy has deep roots is certain to be used as an excuse for even worse violations in societies where rights are more fragile. I think it has become clear that in order to do anything, to have any meaningful impact on the world, we have to work on the local level first. This, I think, is the major pitfall of Arab nationalist thinking, which focused on this top-down efforts to unification. Their nationalist thinking never had the potential to transform into a real transnationalism or internationalism. Yet, I think that is precisely what is needed now more than ever. A real, tangible internationalism. A connection of solidarity between movements, between people, between revolutions. And not just between Arabs, but between communities that are joint in struggle across the global south. An internationalism that is rooted in an understanding of the interconnectivity of all of our struggles against imperialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. One that is rooted in solidarity and in the understandings of the needs to support each other's movements. No leader, no army is going to come save us, and so we have to save each other. And herein lies the two big questions. Who are we? And how do we do this? I am definitely not equipped to answer those questions. I don't think any single one person can. And I think a part of the reason why is because we have been having the same conversations for years, for decades, with the same limits and the same failed strategies, where the forces of reaction have penetrated so deep, not only in our streets, but in our dreams as well. But as painful as it may be, we need to wake up. Otherwise, we are doomed to die in our sleep. And I, for one, am not ready to give up. And I think, if anything, the recent events in Syria have shown us that after years of struggle, of sacrifice, of continuous resistance and organizing, that a major rupture may be around the bend. But I think we need to first abandon nostalgia, abandon the myths of the past. Only then might a new rupture emerge. We have to find a way to dream, to have hopes, while keeping our eyes wide open, looking always ahead. This video was created with the support of From the Periphery Media, and originally released on our Patreon. If you want to help me make more videos like this, please consider becoming a member for as little as $5 a month. With your membership, you also get access to early releases, exclusive content, and an invitation to our monthly hangout. Thank you so much for watching.